Hi everyone, my name is BJ Salazar. I'm gonna be doing my disease report on the bubonic plague. So without further ado, let's just hop right in to some background information on the bacteria that causes this disease. So what exactly is it? The bacteria that causes the bubonic plague is also known as Yersinia pestis. It is a non-motile gram-negative bacteria. And based on that picture on the right where someone's hand is half black, you're probably thinking to yourself, is it what I think it is? And yes, that is the bacteria that caused the pandemic from 1346 to 1353, also known as the Black Death. So that pandemic itself, within that, people, about two-thirds of Europe died, which is about 25 million people, and they all died due to infection of this bacteria. And the mortality rate of people who were getting infected back then was around 30 to 75%, making it a very, very deadly bacteria. So definitely, if you contracted that, you expected to die. You weren't very optimistic whenever you caught that disease. You just altogether wanted to steer clear of contracting it altogether. Moving forward, I just kind of want to talk about the types of plague caused by Yersinia pestis because it's not just the bubonic. There are three types. There's bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. So bubonic is characterized as an infection of your lymph organs, pneumonic is an infection of your lungs, and septicemic is an infection of your blood. So moving on to who does it affect and how does it spread? Yersinia pestis primarily affects humans and animals, and whenever within animals, it especially affects small rodents such as mice and rats. And one interesting thing I read up on was that cats are one thing that is particularly vulnerable to contracting this disease, just because cats love to like kind of eat and kill small rodents. If you've ever been unfortunate enough to own a cat and one day it just brings you one of these dead mice, well then you could contract the cat could contract a disease from the fleas on that dead mouse, or the dead mouse eating the dead mouse itself afflicted by that disease. And from there you could just kind of be in contact with a pet that has that disease. So this is known as a zoonotic disease just because it can bounce back and forth from humans to animals. We can both be carriers and afflict each other with this disease. But I just want to kind of get into the main ways that this disease spread around the times it was most prevalent. And the most primary way was through flea bites. So in the 1300s, 1400s, basically people would be on these big ships, where they would ship resources back and forth, food, water, whatever, and the sailors themselves would be very unhygienic, and so they're basically be just rats just crawling around everywhere, sometimes in barrels, sometimes just all over the ship. And whenever they would get inside the port, the rats would get on in the they would get inside the cities and stuff, and they would just run rampant. And one thing about these fleas is that the fleas wouldn't be in the rat's fur. The fleas were huge carriers of this particular bacteria. And so the fleas would either bite the rats, afflict them, and have the rats themselves bite the humans, giving them that disease. Or the fleas themselves could bite people one time, and then from that point on, you just contracted that Yersinia pestis virus. Another way that you could also contract the disease isn't just through flea bites, even though that was the primary way that it affected people, but you could also come into contact with an infected individual themselves. So basically, let's say you had a family member or a relative and they were infected with it back a few hundred years ago, and you're just trying to take care of them on their deathbed, and you just come into contact constantly with that dead skin on their arm, that gangrene, that necrotic tissue that the plague has just inflicted cell death on. So you're just basically just touching them and stuff, just trying to take care of them, but you're just constantly coming into contact with that infected tissue. But there's also that infected fluid as well. So let's just say they're sitting there bleeding, leaking saliva. You're wiping it up with the rag. They don't wipe their hands, or they're going to wipe their hands, but they just hit that little eye rub, and at that point, the fluid can get in your mucous membrane, and just from there, you can contract the bacteria itself as well. So if any fluid ends up in your ears, eyes, nose, mouth, any mucous membrane, you could contract the bacteria that way as well. And the third way I'd like to talk about how you could contract that bacteria are through infectious droplets. This one's specific to that pneumonic plague I talked a little bit about earlier, that infection of the lungs. So basically when that bacteria gets in your lungs, you're basically just trying to get that bacteria out through that big, heavy, bloody cough. And so as you're coughing that blood out, you're just getting that bacteria on your hand. They touch, maybe they touched your hand, or maybe they were unfortunate enough to be close enough to you for those droplets when you cough to get on one of the mucous membranes on their face, or whenever you sneeze, something around there to get those droplets inside a mucous membrane on your face. but it could also be transmitted through there as well. I just like to talk next. I just like to talk about a fun fact that kind of interested me while I was doing research on this, which is the plague doctors themselves. So, who exactly were the plague doctors? They were doctors hired by cities to treat infected individuals within the city. So back then, they didn't have many great ways to treat or cure people who had the bubonic plague, but they even still they had to try some shape or form of treatment, and the majority of them chose bloodletting, which was where they would cut open a vein in your arm and just kind of try and bleed the bacteria out, or they would try to burn herbs. That way, they try to treat it through some type of a form of aromatherapy, although it was majorly just kind of ineffective. But the primary way that they would actually help aid the survival of humanity and prevent the disease itself from killing more people was through the diagnosis they had during this medieval time. So what they would do is whenever the doctors would come and treat these people, they would give them a doctoral examination. They would write down the signs and symptoms that the people exhibited. They would log it in a notebook, and then they would share it with other doctors. And so this diagnosis just kind of spread throughout the doctoral community. So they had some logged form of being able to identify these people who are sick with this specific plague. And whenever they would log it and diagnose it, whenever it got around the doctoral community, they could confirm if someone had the plague or not, and then they could warn people around the community of whether or not they need to steer clear of these certain people exhibiting these forms. They could just all around prevent, they could all around just represent some type of prevention before you contracted the disease because they didn't have the antibiotics to cure it. So I just thought that was really interesting that they were able to do that even though they didn't have the technology to cure the disease. But I also like the uniforms they wore just to prevent contracting the disease itself. They wore like really thick, heavy garments that way that people weren't constantly touching them with that bacteria, as well as that long beak. Within that long beak they have that's very distinguishable, they had just tons of cloth to prevent that inhalation of those droplets with people who had pneumonic plague. So the doctors altogether were just trying to keep themselves safe by just using different forms of protection. And one thing I also like to talk about is the cane you can barely see there on the side. That cane in particular they used for a form, like medieval form of social distancing. The doctors didn't want to touch the infected individuals due to dealing with so many of them, and they didn't want to just keep touching individuals and eventually contract the disease themselves. So the doctors would kind of poke around the patients and lift up their undergarments just to see what type of symptoms and where the symptoms would occur. Just kind of trying to fill out that log notebook where they're feeling sick the most, what symptoms they're showing, and as well as defend themselves because sometimes the sick individuals would attack doctors for those herbs they thought would cure them. Even though the herbs weren't actually effective, the people still believed they were, so they would attack the doctors to try and get an edge on surviving, even though it was pretty much ineffective. So I just thought that was some very useful information I thought I'd talk about. Moving forward, I just want to talk about the signs and symptoms that they were diagnosing. So for bubonic plague in particular, they diagnosed sudden high fevers and chills, headaches, and most distinguishably, the large swollen leaking lymph nodes. Large swollen leaking lymph nodes that would literally leak pus. And I know you're thinking, why this symptom in particular for bubonic plague? And that leads me to how the bacteria Yersinia pestis replicates. This bacteria primarily replicates in your lymphoid organs, such as the lymph nodes, bone marrow, liver, and spleen. If you've been paying attention in our recent lectures on immunology, you'd know that these particular lymphoid organs are where our basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and just altogether all of our immune cells like to reside, mature, and replicate. So doesn't it seem kind of counterproductive that a bacteria would want to attack an area where the majority of your immune cells reside? At first, yes. But then when you think about it, the bacteria actually likes to undergo binary fusion at an extreme rate in order to replicate itself enough to counteract and overwhelm the immune cells in those lymphoid organs. And so once the bacteria altogether overwhelms the immune cells in the lymphoid organs, it's a free-for-all. And that leads me to my next slide, which is why it was such a huge killer. With the immune system being defeated so early on upon initial infection, combined with the fact that there were not antibiotics during this time period, there was nothing people could do. That was why this disease was such a killer. It had defeated your immune system and you didn't have antibiotics, so there was nothing to deter this bacteria from just running rampant through your body. So no immune system almost guaranteed the death of the host. But fortunately enough, Nowadays, we have treatments for this type of bacteria, which are antibiotics such as ciprofloxacin, levofloxacin, oxyfloxacin, gentamicin, or doxycycline. And these antibiotics are just proven to be the most effective at neutralizing the bacteria and preventing their growth, which leads me on to prevention as well. So, prevention of this disease typically includes making your yard and hospital to small rodents such as mice, because we previously talked about how they are the biggest carriers of this disease with those fleas in their fur, as well as flea control products for your pets, because fleas were a huge carrier, long-term reservoir for this virus, for this bacteria. So since these fleas are such big reservoirs for this bacteria, you don't want it being on your furry friend just always around you, as well as extra clothing for those fleas to not bite you directly, and insect repellent for, let's say you want to walk through the woods and you just don't want to come into contact with those specific fleas that could directly give you that virus. Basically, these are just some preventable measures you could take to not come into contact directly with that strain of bacteria. That's really all I have for this. Thank you very much.